The next 3 lectures in this series will deal with principles of description in your writing. This and the coming lectures will be based on Woodward and Wiener's books, The Craft of Prose and Great Writing. Craft of Prose and Great Writing. I will also be using some examples from Alicia Rasley's The Power of Point of View, Natalie Goldberg's Writing Down the Bones, Brenda Ueland's If You Want to Write, and Leon Surmelian's Techniques of Fiction Writing. These lectures will be slightly different than normal lectures on description. Normally, teaching description in writing is primarily focused on writing fiction. Fiction is a type of writing genre which is heavily influenced by narrative structure, character analysis, and using imagery to evoke the senses and put the reader in an emotional state so that the reader can personally identify with the characters. However, in these series of lectures, I will be describing how these same techniques can be applied to non-fiction writing, such as essays which require heavy research and investigation. Once you have completed these lectures, you will not only be able to use these fiction techniques to write fiction, but you will also be able to use these fiction techniques to write powerful nonfiction. However, I do have a disclaimer. Many publishers or purveyors of nonfiction are strict in formal writing requirements, and many do not utilize these fiction techniques for different reasons. For example, if you are writing an engineering or biochemistry paper, you will not find these techniques useful in the writing of professional articles for an academic or scientific journal. However, by utilizing these techniques in a popular science format, such as a popular science magazine or in a form of consumer periodical, you will more effectively communicate with a general audience. So, even if you are not a scientist, you know about Albert Einstein. He is perhaps one of the most famous, if not the most famous, scientists in the world. While he did make several very important scientific discoveries, the reasons why he was so famous was because he could perform very well in 2 key areas. Number 1, he wrote in English so he could communicate with a massive audience across the world. And number 2, he wrote in a style for a popular audience. Listen to an example of how he began to introduce Isaac Newton to his audience in an article he wrote for The Guardian in 1942. Reason, of course, is weak when measured against its never-ending task. Weak indeed compared with the follies and passions of mankind, which we must admit almost entirely control our human destinies in great things and small. Yet works of understanding outlast the noisy bustling of generations and spread light and warmth across the centuries. Consoled by this thought, let us turn in these unquiet days to the memory of Isaac Newton, who 300 years ago was given to mankind. In this short passage, Einstein uses English, a language he struggled to learn and prefers not to speak, to evoke the noisy bustling of generations, the unquiet days, and the spreading of light and warmth across the centuries. These are not phrases that you would normally read in a scientific article, but Einstein, as one of the most preeminent scientists during the Great War, uses these phrases to evoke emotion from his reader. In another article where he is discussing his own theory of relativity with the general public, he uses sensory metaphors to describe his own scientific theory. Listen to this passage. Since the time of the ancient Greeks, it has been well known that in describing the motion of a body, we must refer to another body. The motion of a railway car or railway train is described with reference to the ground, of a planet with reference to the total assemblage of visible fixed stars. In physics, the bodies to which motions are spatially referred are termed systems of coordinates. The laws of mechanics of Galileo and Newton can be formulated only by using a system of coordinates. By using the visceral and evocative feeling of traveling on a train, he is emitting a shared experience that all his readers can share together. Besides his obvious mastery of English as a language to communicate, he is also trying to level with his readers rather than speaking down to them like he would a child who doesn't know science. And this is the important part. When necessary, again, when necessary, he uses description to connect to the humanity of his reader. And this is the goal of what these lectures are trying to teach you, to use these techniques when necessary to grab the attention of your audience and communicate basic truths to them outside of the specialization that you operate within. So let's talk about it. What is description? According to Woodward, description comes from the Latin describere, meaning to write about. Description is one of the four main types of discourse, the other three being exposition, argumentation, and narration. We have already discussed exposition in some previous lectures, and in the future, we will be reviewing narration and finally argumentation. When a writer describes something, he conveys mood, images, sensations, communicating experience rather than providing factual information or conducting an argument or telling a story. By its very nature, description is artistic. Maybe you don't believe you are an artist, and that's fine. Even if you are not an artist, you are still a human being, and you still know when something is beautiful and when something is ugly. The important thing to know is that description uses images to communicate, much like certain forms of poetry or certain kinds of lyrics to music. Sensory language is used to convey these emotions. When we talk about sensory language, we're talking about the five senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. The writer's job is to use language to put mental images into the reader's mind as reminders of these five senses. Like the example above, Einstein evokes sensory feelings of sound when he uses the word bustling. And then he evokes sensory feelings of touch when he uses the phrase light and warmth. Something as simple as that can be the key in connecting with your reader. Einstein doesn't use this kind of language often, but just when he needs the reader to have a visceral reaction to a complex scientific theory. So, there are two kinds of description: realistic and impressionistic. Every kind of description operates like a camera taking a picture of something. The item that you capture with the camera can be viewed in a very scientific and objective way. For example, you might look at a picture of something for sale on an online website selling things. Or also, the item could be viewed very subjectively or emotionally, with the item taken from a certain angle with a very strange background that makes you feel sad. And the item itself could also make you feel very sad. The camera that you are using captures the details of the object, but the way the picture is framed changes the emotional impact of the image itself. Still, When you describe something, you must describe that thing. But the way you describe it will change the way your reader understands that thing. When you describe an object, you freeze the object and describe it in striking clarity. You can discuss the intricacies, the details, the history, the shape, and the relationship of that object to other things. Your description gives the reader a sensory representation of reality, a painting of words, and a spatial dimension. However, Aristotle, in Book 3 of his Rhetoric, explains that to describe something, you must describe that object in a state of activity, giving life to lifeless objects, using grammar such as active verbs to show these lifeless objects or ideas as being alive, at least in the mind. These two principles, number one, being able to freeze an object and explore it, and number two, breathing life into a lifeless object, are both excellent strategies for describing objects, places, or people. Now, a realistic description's goals are to describe a place, object, or person from a singular point of view, while an impressionistic description is a holistic, a whole view of an object, showing how that thing being described is related to many other things and fits into a bigger puzzle. Now, listen to this scene from chapter 3 of Joseph Conrad's Lord Jim, and try to answer the question, is this a realistic or impressionistic description? A marvelous stillness pervaded the world, and the stars, together with the serenity of their rays, seemed to shed upon the earth the assurance of everlasting security. The young moon recurved, and shining low in the west, was like a slender shaving thrown up from a bar of gold, and the Arabian Sea, smooth and cool to the eye like a sheet of ice, extended its perfect level to the perfect circle of a dark horizon. The propeller turned without a check, as though its beat had been part of the scheme of a safe universe. And on each side of the patina, two deep folds of water, permanent and somber on the unwrinkled shimmer, enclosed within their straight and diverging ridges a few white swirls of foam bursting in a low hiss, a few wavelets, a few ripples, a few undulations that, left behind, agitated the surface of the sea for an instant after the passage of the ship, subsided splashing gently, calmed down at last into the circular stillness of water and sky, with the black speck of the moving hull remaining everlastingly in its center. In this passage, you can hear the hissing foam and a gentle splash as the ship sails by. You can feel the smooth, cool Arabian Sea and see the marvelous stillness of the moment. You can see the reflecting moon in the dark, the somber folds of water, the ripples and undulations of the waves. This is a form of artistic photography that Conrad can render into a scene that probably takes no less than 3 seconds of time. He is not telling a fiction here. Rather, he is just describing the movement of a boat along the water during the night. Now, no one expects you to write like Conrad, although if you can, that is a wonderful talent. I'm using this example to show you how good description can become a kind of fuel for your reader, a kind of music that holds your reader to your theme, or a kind of hunger that you can fill your reader with so that he eagerly finishes your piece of writing, hoping for a conclusion to that image, hoping for a way to participate in the symphony you are projecting. Descriptions must use details to be effective. So how do you choose the right details? For some people, Conrad's description of the boat going through the water may be too much. Too many words, too many details, too many unnecessary descriptions. How do you carefully select the details you will use when describing something? Especially if you are writing a nonfiction article like an essay, you must be especially careful you stick to your thesis and you don't write a personal monologue. And you must make sure you focus on your research and use description when necessary. After all, you are not Joseph Conrad, and you are not writing a novel. But even if you were writing a novel, you might still choose to be very careful in the selection of details you choose to describe. Isabel Wilkerson, who won the Pulitzer Prize for The Warmth of Other Suns, which was a book about the American history of the Great Migration, she was describing a photo she found in her mother's drawer. Even though her book is an intensely researched history of families during the almost century-long migrations they took from the American South to the American North and American West during the 20th century, listen to the language she used when describing this photo. The passenger train came wheezing through the North Georgia mountains after the colored school let out. And when it passed through the hill town of Rome, Georgia, back during the Depression, a little girl would run down the embankment and wait for it to rush past the locust trees. She would wave to the people in the metal boxes on wheels, the important people, their faces looking away, and dream of going wherever it was they were rushing to. While Wilkerson could just have easily have written, "When doing research for this book, I found a photograph of my mother waving to people at a train station in Rome, Georgia." Instead, she decided to describe the image from the point of view from the girl and show how this photograph was an example for a larger theme of her book through this detailed scene. So, another key aspect of description is point of view. Because this lecture, or really any of my lectures, is not about writing stories, but rather about writing narrative nonfiction, I won't be going into the details of point of view as it relates to fiction. Point of view in fiction can become very complicated, as you have first person, or using I to describe things, second person, or using you to communicate ideas to the reader personally, or third person when using he, she, or they to describe what other people are doing in a given situation. You also have impersonal forms, which remove the author as an active agent, personal forms, which include the author as an active agent, single forms, which focus on a specific individual, multiple forms, which focus on several people at the same time, as well as even more advanced forms, such as the classical omniscient, where the author knows everything but is totally outside the story, and the contemporary omniscient, where the author knows everything but is also part of the story. There are very specific ways to implement these forms in fiction, and I will not be going into that. However, the point of what I am saying to you is you must know and acknowledge the point of view that you are using. If you are not aware of what point of view you are using in your writing, you won't be using a specific point of view, and the reader will be confused. For example, right now with you, I am using a classically omniscient point of view where I am integrating the first person and second person interchangeably. I am using I to describe my own actions, you to describe what you should be doing as you are listening to this lecture, and we when talking about generalities that both you and I should be thinking about. The fact that I know I am using these points of view when designing this lecture is important, because I can then utilize those points of view to greater efficiency in communicating some key lessons to you. Now, for the remainder of the lecture, I will be addressing some professional techniques you can use in your descriptions to bring out the emotion more fully you want to communicate. I will be talking about tone, figurative language, similes, metaphors, personification, alliteration, assonance, and consonance, onomatopoeia, and the principle of showing rather than telling when writing descriptions. Tone refers to the writer's attitude towards both his materials and his readers. This attitude is then transferable from the writer to the reader. After the reader is finished, she will have adopted the attitude of the writer if the writer was successful in communicating a certain tone. For example, if the writer is very angry about something, like a sad situation in a family, then the writer will use descriptions to show the pitiable state of a family, the poor clothes they are wearing, the meager food they are eating, the dilapidated and ramshackle home they're living in, the sickness of the youngest child, and the lack of health care in the community. When the reader finishes, she will also feel quite sad about the state of the family, and maybe even angry, especially if the writer wrote about how other people knew about the sad state of affairs and knowingly chose not to do anything. However, what if the writer adopted a different tone? For example, maybe the writer wrote about how the family in their difficult situation was heroic in their battling a tragic circumstance. Even though the child was sick, the mother spent hours at his bedside, caring for him. Even though the family had little food, the father went to the fields every day, all day in the hot sun, to first pick the vegetables and then to the market to sell, so that he could buy some meat to bring home to his family so that they could survive another day. Instead of feeling angry or sad at their situation, the reader would feel inspired, and she would want to have that same kind of heroic attitude in her own life. Before you begin writing anything, you should know the tone you want to set, and you should double check your writing to make sure the correct tone is being emphasized, or at least not be confusing to your reader, unless, of course, you want the reader to be confused. Sometimes that is a legitimate strategy as well. There are two kinds of figurative devices that writers use. The first figurative device is known as the simile, and the second figurative device is known as the metaphor. These devices operate with a very simple mechanism. They describe something by comparing it with something else. However, on a deep level, they compare in two very different ways. Both kinds of figurative devices must be, number one, fresh or new, powerful, and easily understandable. Number two, vivid or emotional, contemplative, and sensory. And three, precise or in focus, realistically measurable and specific. The goal of a figurative device is to shift the mood from objective to subjective, although how far or close that subjectivity is up to you as the writer. The simile uses the words like or as to make direct comparisons. For example, black as pitch, bright as a penny, brown as a berry, flat as a pancake, hard as a rock, high as the sky, sharp as a tack, skinny as a rail, sweet as sugar, or tough as nails. An excellent example of simile comes from the writer Stephen Crane when he wrote, "The craft prances and rears and plunged like a horse making at a fence outrageously high." Essentially, the simile is a way to attach qualities of one object to another object without needing to reimagine the object. Similes are additive. They add qualities to an existing object. This is a very important detail that many people have not understood. If you want to keep the fundamental nature of an object uncorrupted, but want to express how that object functions in a novel way, you can use the simile to express these new and exciting variables. For example, "He was tall as a tree" can be changed to "he was short as a bush." Or even, more minutely, you can say, "he was short as a shoe." You aren't imagining the man as a literal shoe, but you are imagining that he is very, very short. The metaphor, on the other hand, is an indirect comparison in which an object literally transforms its fundamental nature. For example, Professor Jones is an old bear. When I say this, you might imagine Professor Jones as a literal bear, or you might imagine that he is a hairy man, or you might imagine his face is scrunched up and he growls a lot. You might also imagine that maybe he just lives in a little cave, that he has large hands with long fingers, or that he likes to eat fish. There are many indirect thoughts you might have with a metaphor, and the point of a metaphor is to express all those ideas at the same time. In some ways, Chinese poetry is a pure metaphor, with 1,000 different meanings expressed in the lines that can be interpreted by people in 1,000 different ways. But really, the poet only uses 4 or 6 words to express 1,000 different words. Metaphors also carry an immediate sensory impact on the reader. For example, "the company was deluged with orders" gives the immediate sensory image of paperwork flooding an office, something like a hurricane or storm transforming the office space into a disaster area. Personification is when an object takes on human characteristics. Personification is a technique the writer uses to transform a non-human entity into behaving like a human in a certain way. Mark Twain describes a frog in The Jumping Frog of Calaveras County as modest and straightforward. And he talks about when the frog tries to jump, he heaves and strains his shoulders like a Frenchman. We generally don't think of frogs as being modest or straightforward. And we don't think of people from France as being frogs. But Twain's use of personification takes this small amphibian and transforms him into a creature with human characteristics. But why should you use personification? It seems a bit ridiculous to compare an inanimate object or non-human creature with a human. To some degree, yes, it is ridiculous. And you do have to be careful about doing this, as you may end up creating a fallacy of disbelief in which your reader doesn't believe you or suspects you are trying to trick them. Personification, unlike simile or metaphor, is a kind of figurative language, but it is also a kind of a lie. Writing that your desk is tall as the sky, or writing that your desk is a mountain, might be true. But saying that your desk looms over you like a Frenchman is making a judgment not only about the French, but about your own relationship to the French. Sometimes personification can be galling or insulting. We will talk about this in a later lecture when we discuss the concept of satire and how important but dangerous satire is. Understand that Mark Twain is a satirist, and satire is not only a form of writing, but also a form of indirect social commentary. Finally, we have the last 4 types of professional techniques. I am putting these together because all of these techniques rely on the auditory function of language. Let's try to understand this with a little more depth. English, unlike most of the languages of Europe, is not a Romance language. Romance languages doesn't mean a language of love. Actually, Romance comes from the term Romanicus, or language from Rome. That is, being derived from Latin, the language of Rome. Instead, English is what is known as a Germanic language and operates in a fundamentally different way than Romance languages. Without getting into the linguistic functions of the 2 types of languages, you can think about Romance languages being tied to narrative verses or a kind of poetical rhythm, and English being more visceral and attacking sort of language. That is why when you speak languages such as French, Latin, Spanish, you often feel like you are speaking poetry, because the languages themselves were designed, in some respects, to communicate culture and history through verse and song. While when you speak English, it often feels more guttural, primitive, and you seem to lose the poetic sense of yourself. Words in English like rock, flash, rash, these words often sound the way they feel. Whereas, for example, in French, the same words, la roche, éclair, l'éruption, these words sound mesmerizing and almost ethereal, floating on clouds or coming alive in a musical song. Therefore, if you are writing in English, certain techniques for writing in English are quite important for evoking certain feelings among your readers. I don't want to say these techniques are not used in other languages, especially the Romance languages. They are, and they are wonderful. But when using these techniques in English, there are some principles you need to abide by, so let's review some of what those are. Alliteration is the repetition of sounds at the beginning of words or of stressed syllables. Alliteration is an emotive device used to inspire empathy in the reader. For example, using Mark Twain again, he wrote, "The majestic, the magnificent Mississippi." Here, the alliteration was about the repetition of the letter M in 3 words in a row: majestic, magnificent, and Mississippi. Within the function of alliteration are 2 differing approaches. The first is assonance, in which the repeated or stressed sounds are the vowel sounds. The second is consonance, or the repetition or stress of consonant sounds. So, when Twain describes a glimpse of a river as a sort of sea, and withal a very still and brilliant and lovely one, he's actually using all 3 devices. Alliteration in a sort of sea, in which the S of sort is paired with the S of sea. Assonance in withal, still, brilliant, in which the I of withal, still, and brilliant are repeated. And consonance in withal, still, brilliant, lovely, in which the L sound of withal, still, brilliant, and lovely are repeated. Now you may say, Mr. Seeberger, that seems convenient. It looks like you are just making that up. But if you changed any of the words in that sentence, it would effectively cut and break the alliteration of the sentence. So in this way, even when you are writing a description of a place like a river, you can use alliteration to great effect, one that is poetic and haunting and stays with your reader for many years. Lastly, onomatopoeia is a kind of advanced technique where the sound of the word also describes the meaning of the word. For example, the whirring sound of the glass windows as the cable car passes, in which the way you say whir sounds like the glass windows might sound if they passed you on a rickety train. In English, onomatopoeia is quite easy, as there are many words that sound like what they mean. However, you still must be intentional about it. For example, if I wrote, "I slammed the door shut," you can hear, even feel, the door crashing closed. However, if I wrote, "I slammed the drink down my throat," you might understand that I drank the juice so forcefully that it rushed into my mouth and down my throat. But the word slam might feel a bit off, or you might wonder if I hurt myself when I did this or if I choked on the juice. On the other hand, if I wrote, "I drained the swirling contents of the cup down my throat," the onomatopoeia here feels like a whirlpool where the juice is swirling down my throat into a bottomless pit after being flushed out of the cup. Before I end this lecture, I wanted to talk about showing, not telling. Of course, in any piece of writing, you absolutely must tell your reader something. That is the whole point of writing something. You are trying to imbue or pass on knowledge from yourself to your reader. So when we say show, not tell, this is not saying never tell, but rather this is about having a proper balance between showing and telling. You should always attempt to paint a scene for your reader, even if you are discussing something very esoteric and complex. You should always place the idea within a proper context when you are utilizing these narrative forms. As Brenda Ueland teaches in If You Want to Write, describe something as it is. Do not worry if it is angular and clumsy or how it comes out. Just look at something and put down what you see. Remember William Blake, who said, "Improvement makes straight roads, but the crooked roads without improvement are roads of genius." What Barbara is saying by quoting Blake is that when you describe something, don't leave anything out. Include the blemishes, the ugly spots, and the holes. If you're trying to describe a village in the countryside and you want to evoke the feelings of the people who live there, don't only briefly sketch the history of the village and talk about the village leader. Actually, go into a home and talk about the peeling wallpaper, the fields that have dried up because the soil has lost the warmth, and the trees that no longer grow at the edges of the property. Natalie Goldberg, in Writing Down the Bones, says this: "Writing is not psychology. We do not talk about feelings. Instead, the writer feels and through her words awakens those feelings in the reader. The writer takes the reader's hand and guides him through the valley of sorrow and joy without ever having to mention those words." To some degree, when integrating narrative writing into nonfiction, you do need to blend approaches. For example, if you're writing an essay about psychology, you may want to express those psychological theories that are in the literature. But when you give an example of how that works itself out in daily life, you take the time to show how that becomes reality in the face of a woman who lost her husband, or in the hands of a son who lost his father. In conclusion, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, Not all these approaches will be useful in the writing of nonfiction. Some of these approaches may be useful, or perhaps many or possibly all of them. Furthermore, narrative nonfiction is not meant strictly for the professional class, but rather for the popularization of the professional class. I'd like to conclude with another quote from Albert Einstein in one of the final books he authored, known as The Evolution of Physics, from his chapter Quanta. Here, he is describing the concept of the quanta of light. Listen to how he is able to take an incredibly complex idea and break it down into language that his reader can understand and visualize. Let us consider a wall built along the seashore. The waves from the sea continually impinge on the wall, wash away some of its surface, and retreat, leaving the way clear for the incoming waves. The mass of the wall decreases, and we can ask how much is washed away in, say, 1 year. But now, let us picture a different process. We want to diminish the mass of the wall by the same amount as previously, but in a different way. We shoot at the wall and split it at the places where the bullets hit. The mass of the wall will be decreased, and we can well imagine that the same reduction in mass is achieved in both cases. But from the appearance of the wall, we could easily detect whether the continuous sea wave or the discontinuous shower of bullets has been acting. It will be helpful in understanding the phenomena which we are about to describe to bear in mind the difference between sea waves and a shower of bullets. You see, Einstein knew his audience. Most of his audience were men who had just been through the most horrific war in history. They had immediate and visceral knowledge about both waves and bullets. They could picture them in frightening detail. His popular scientific writings are littered with this kind of style, of brazenly attacking a subject by describing things in clear, precise language, linking them with metaphors or examples, and relying on his readers' internalized experience to make sense of his words. This is how you elevate writing to something majestic, monumental, and memorable. Use description to pair your intention with the feelings of your reader.